Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Guy Ritchie offers up a new take on the King Arthur lore as Charlie Hunnam discovers the legend of the sword and his destiny. After his father, King Uther, played by Eric Bana, is usurped by his treacherous brother Vortigern, played by Jude Law, to take the throne, Arthur, played by Charlie Hunnam, grew up in a brothel on the tough streets of Londinium, largely unaware of his heritage, but with recurring nightmares of the day he escaped. Vortigern is determined to find his nephew, who has the power to defeat him, and when Arthur is forced to pull Excalibur from the stone and succeeds, he must confront his fears and face his destiny to defeat Vortigern to take the crown he rightly deserves. There have been many cinematic versions of The Legend of King Arthur on screen. By far the most popular is John Boorman's Excalibur, a film that even Guy Ritchie himself cited as being a major influence on this film. You also got the likes of Sean Connery in First Night, or the 2004 Jerry Bruckheimer produced film directed by Antoine Fuqua that tried to show the man behind the legend according to its marketing materials, which is a bit of an unusual claim to make considering there is no historical basis whatsoever that King Arthur actually existed beyond mythology and folklore. But generally what that meant is that they were striving for a much more realistic, gritty tone, which unfortunately meant it was rather boring, to be honest, as I remember it being when I saw that movie when it came out. 13 years later, Guy Ritchie brings us his version of the tale, which is very different from the last one because it concentrates on high fantasy. And I do mean high. Check out the size of those massive, gigantic elephants in the film's opening sequence. Oh yes, there hasn't been a version like Legend of the Sword before. That's not necessarily a compliment either. I get what Ritchie is trying to do with this new version of King Arthur, because it's much the same as what he did with Sherlock Holmes, and he took a character that was often depicted as quite a staid intellectual and emphasised the physical aspects of him that hadn't been seen in previous adaptations, and really made it feel modern and contemporary. That's what he's trying to do with King Arthur, but doesn't nearly succeed as well. I will say this about the film: it's very much a Guy Ritchie movie. His fingerprints are all over it, despite the rumours of reshoots and restructures and rescripting. It's very much a movie that feels like a product of his imagination. In order to make the movie feel much more modern, he's had the characters speak in very anachronistic dialogue that feels very much like a bunch of Cockney geezers. That's basically what this is. It's basically Guy Ritchie's dialogue transplanted into the 5th century. It's an idea that almost sort of works in that it feels just earthy enough that it would actually make sense and it kind of translates. But a lot of Guy Ritchie's dialogue, although it's quite witty sometimes and quite amusing, it's also very self-conscious and very much draws attention to itself. And that makes the dialogue in this movie feel especially out of place, because you really don't expect to see a King Arthur movie where the characters speak like they're down the pub exchanging banter. And that's very much representative of the tone of the movie. This is a very hyper-masculine take on the lore. It's not enough in this version that he was raised on the streets. Oh no, he's a street fighter. He basically learns how to beat people up and solve problems with his fists and aggression. And it's the sort of movie where there are several scenes where characters scream into the air like this in slow motion to show how intense they are. That happens several times in this movie, and it often feels like Ritchie is actually borrowing from the Zack Snyder book, although that does make sense because Zack Snyder himself is massively influenced by Excalibur. But there is a lot of action scenes in this movie that feel very influenced by the sort of approach that Snyder favours in his action scenes, and there's a lot of speed up, then slow down action scenes. That happens over and over again. The fantasy elements of the movie are so bizarre and out of left field because they never properly establish rules for what's going on, other than mages have the ability to control animals. So there are sequences where there are massive elephants or giant snakes that burst into scenes. Animals will turn on their masters. There's all kinds of crazy things that Ritchie is throwing at the screen. You've got Jude Law, who in the first 10 minutes of the movie is suddenly killing his wife and offering her up as a sacrifice to some sort of siren monster so that he can get some superpowers. And that is a most definite influence on this version of King Arthur. It's very much a proto-superhero movie. So you have King Arthur grabbing Excalibur out of the stone, has to feel the full power of it. The power of Excalibur is really over the top in this version, in that it's basically Thor's hammer. But the way this feels most like a Guy Ritchie movie is in the editing and structure, because it is the most Guy Ritchie movie you could possibly imagine in those departments. It's way too much. You know how Guy Ritchie has a real liking for characters describing what happened, and then he'll cross-cut with a flashback of what actually happened, and sometimes there'll be ironic juxtapositions. Oh, that happens in Arthur quite early on. There's a 5-minute sequence where he describes his day because he confronted a Viking, but believe me, that's an embodiment of what the film does on a huge scale throughout, in that it just leapfrogs through time, and there's all sorts of flashbacks and cross-cuts. There's barely any scenes that actually play like scenes in King Arthur. It always feels like they've been chopped up in a blender, and it really makes the movie hard to follow at points. It just makes the film unnecessarily dense. It's not actually all that complicated, it's just because Guy Ritchie insists on cutting every single moment, both in terms of making the movie look like a 2-hour montage essentially, and boy howdy is there loads of montages in this film, but also the way the film is cut in general is very cut, especially in the action sequences. You don't know what is happening in the action scenes because everything is happening so fast on screen that you barely get time to process anything. It's really quite frustrating. You just want to grab Guy Ritchie and say, for goodness sake, just tell a story straight. This isn't helped by the fact the main plot of the movie revolves around that Arthur has to confront his fears. And so he has to relive his nightmares. He's reliving the night that he became an orphan. So we have to keep seeing that scene 4 or 5 times throughout the film. And the idea is generally that we see a little bit more of it each time, because he's learning that a king doesn't look away. Except we know how that scene plays out. Ritchie tries to avoid this problem by abruptly cutting away the first time it happens into the opening title sequence, but generally we know what happened, we can fill in the blanks, and it's not really surprising. It's played like it's vaguely like it's a reveal, which really doesn't work. It's just so bizarre that he's played it like this. If it was one flashback, that would help, but no, we keep having to go back over this again and again, and it feels very repetitive, and that's exactly what the editing structure of this movie feels like. It's like, oh, that would have been nice once, you don't have to keep doing it over and over again. It does feel like Ritchie was forced to cut his movie down from at least 2.5 hours. There are definitely moments that feel like vestiges of much longer sequences that were almost totally eliminated in the final version of the film. There's a bit fairly late into it where a character gets captured, a fairly key character, and that happens off screen, and they have to confront Jude Law about it. That happens on screen, but it basically gets resolved in a very diplomatic manner in less than maybe 2 or 3 minutes of screen time, and then that character's back again. Just the bits where she actually got captured and the bits where she got returned all happened off screen. Why did this bit actually need to be in the movie? And this is combined with the film's cinematography, because if you've seen a Guy Ritchie movie, you know how he controls the camera in that it can be often very wild, very much trying to push into the action very forcefully, and again, it doesn't work. There's a chase sequence in the movie where he's decided to strap the actors with GoPros to their heads, but what the result is less making you feel like you're in the moment with the characters, and more distractingly reminded me of the Sir Digby Chicken Caesar sketches from that Mitchell and Webb look, where they did the exact same trick, except it was done for comical effect, and not having the actors scream about 10 inches away from the camera. And needless to say, don't go and see this movie in its 3D presentation, how I saw it. It's a really bad post-conversion job, and it really is a very ugly looking movie in that format because it's very earthy, very grey, it looks very dull and flat for a lot of its running time, and it doesn't really yield itself very well to the 3D format because of course Guy Ritchie's cutting every single second. Occasionally, in the action sequences, there'll be a CGI moment that does actually play towards the 3D presentation of the film. They really do pop out at the screen at you to the point where you just go, oh man, really? That feels out of place with the rest of the film. It doesn't feel like Ritchie has brought a coherent style to the film. He's brought his bundle of ticks to the table. I will say this about the film, it cost $175 million to make. It certainly looks like it. This really has a grand, epic sweep to it, especially in the production design. The design of Londinium and Camelot, they both feel very lived in, and there is a lot of really gigantic CGI work in this movie, really extensively on screen, and a lot of it is actually quite impressive in a lot of ways, but at the same time you find yourself watching what's happening on screen and just going, what am I even looking at? I found myself being genuinely bewildered at certain points at just the unusual creative decisions that Ritchie decides to make at various points in the film. There is, for instance, a certain soccer player in this film making a cameo. I know that cameo has been spoiled, but just in case you haven't, I'm not going to reveal him here. But he's in the movie, and he's a terrible actor. And what makes that even more glaring is that Ritchie, in his infinite wisdom, decided to place him in the scene where the sword is pulled from the stone. Why would you do that? Hunnam goes to the dark place to confront his fears, this secluded island, and it apparently just happens to have giant, monstrous-sized animals on it that are common fears. So there are huge bats on this island, and there's a moment where he has to fight what appears to be the rodents of unusual size from The Princess Bride. Oh yes, that happens. If you've ever wanted to see Charlie Hunnam wrestle a giant rat, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword is the movie for you. But really, at its crux, it is an origin story. And for all the strangeness that's happening on screen, in a lot of ways, King Arthur is surprisingly dull. It's very much a story that you've seen before, and he doesn't really bring a take on the material that really manages to get past that. And it really embodies several of the tropes of origin stories, and it feels the need to explain everything unnecessarily, sometimes to really comical degrees. I could tell you what the origin of the sword and the stone in this movie is, but you wouldn't believe me because it sounds like a joke that actually happens on screen, but no. What happens with the sword and the stone is so ridiculous that I almost burst out laughing. For all of its faults, Charlie Hunnam is really good in this movie. He brings a certain amount of wit and charm to the character in that he's meant to be a bit of a rogue, and he's just built like crazy. You can tell that Hunnam is very much committed to the physicality of the part, and just generally giving a really sturdy performance that I think in a better film would have been terrific. But unfortunately, he's just swamped by the material like so many other people in this film. Jude Law, who is re-teaming with Guy Ritchie on this film as the main villain, it's a very uneven performance. There are points in this film where he definitely is camping up at certain points. He is really playing a bit of a pantomime villain. There's definitely moments where he's playing evil, evil, evil. And then there will be other moments where it feels like it's a slightly more complicated character in that he's so desperate for power that he has to commit enormous personal sacrifice, and that's slightly more interesting than the generic character that he's often seen on screen, but we very rarely get to see it. But on the other hand, the female lead of the film, Astrid Burgess Frisbee, is really terrible in this movie. She is playing the mage. That's her character name, incidentally, as she's billed in the credits. She's simply the mage. And that pretty much sums up the film's approach to its female characters, in that they're pretty much afterthoughts. I mean, its lead female character doesn't even get the luxury of an actual name. She's not even playing Guinevere, she's just the mage. Fantastic. And she's basically there to occasionally provide some magic and fantasy. And you can tell that she's very bored in this part. She delivers her lines in a flat monotone the entire time. You could tell that she really wasn't getting anything to play and just registered that on screen immensely. The film's got a really terrific supporting cast for the most part, doing the best with what they can with the material, but because it's so frantic, a lot of them just kind of get lost in the shuffle. Charlie Hunnam's Queer as Folk co-star, Aidan Gillen turns up, Djimon Hounsou. Eric Bana is wasted again playing Arthur's father, a part that is over with before most of the opening credits have rolled and only appears afterwards in flashbacks and visions. He really, for some reason, gets a lot of these parts that are so tiny that they don't get to show off his talents, and he is really criminally underutilized in this movie. Although it really doesn't help that, again, that opening portion of the movie is so cut up that it feels like it was taken from a much longer prologue. But mostly though, it just feels like Ritchie scumming to his worst indulgences, where he just throws things on screen and doesn't really care how they all fit together. It's the kind of movie that has a martial arts monastery led by a guy named George, like it was out of a 70s kung fu film. They're just randomly in the film, because I guess they can be. By the time the third act rolls around, the movie has gone completely off the rails and has turned into an absolute CGI fest. And unfortunately, the sequences where Arthur has to use his powers with Excalibur are visualised in such a way that it feels like, in terms of CGI work, we've stepped back a decade. It's really embarrassing stuff where Hunnam gets suddenly replaced by a CGI double of himself that goes around like the Flash. The final fight scene feels like the boss level of a computer game, because there is no grounding to it whatsoever. It's just entirely wild masses of CGI, to the point where one of the lead actors is a CGI version of himself. It feels like the climax of the movie was reshot, but they didn't have Jude Law on set and had to work around him. What a really puzzling set of choices King Arthur really is. I mean, my goodness, at least it's committed to its bananas vision of itself. But this is a real misfire. It's the first true flop of the summer season, I'm afraid. King Arthur, Legend of the Sword is one of the most bizarre big-budget films to come out in a while. Guy Ritchie's hyper-masculine take on the legend is an extremely uneasy mix, with his signature scenes of supercut, banter-heavy dialogue that is very anachronistic for this setting, colliding against scenes of wild fantasy and magic, creating a tonal whiplash that is often distracting and self-conscious. That's especially the case with the erratic editing and structure as the narrative jumps around into flashback, or sequences chopped up into cross-cut montages that make it hard to process what's happening, not helped by the feeling that there's scenes missing, the dizzying flash trying to obscure that it's a fairly standard origin story at its heart. Hunnam's tough and intense, but Law is vamping as the villain, and by its conclusion the film drowns under poor CGI that makes it resemble a video game. It's a mess that's so committedly weird it's almost charming, but mostly it's a dog's breakfast. If you like this review, please support my work over at Patreon, where you can see my reviews early, among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.